defamed as presumptively anti-Semitic when they engage in political discourse, political debate, especially on Palestine. The second issue is that the second point is that reframing discrimination against Muslims and Arabs as rational national security are necessary to protect American liberalism relies on racist stereotypes that Muslims are violent, they're misogynistic, they're anti-democratic, and they are intolerant and illiberal. And then finally, 22 years of normalization of these stereotypes has primed Americans to believe libelous claims that Muslims hate Jews, that Muslims are taught to hate Jews, that Islam teaches them to hate Jews, which is false, unless proven otherwise. And as a result, it's easy to dismiss Muslims and Arabs as liars, untrustworthy, and undeserving of empathy, which we're seeing right now with the complete lack of empathy for the over 20,000 Palestinians thus far, and the death toll is climbing, that are killed by the Israeli military, that have been killed by the Israeli military over the last 9 months. 40,000 civilian Palestinians have been injured, and we still have 3,000 to 5,000 missing, presumed dead, under the rubble of residential buildings that have been bombed by Israel. So let's just define Islamophobia, and this is the definition that Mitchell and I took in the report, or adopted, is an exaggerated fear and hostility of Islam and Muslims by the state and the public as a result of imputed inferior biological and cultural traits based on religious identity that produce systemic bias, discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion of Muslims from social, political, and civil life. Now, we also recognize that although anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism is separate from Islamophobia, the two overlap because all Arabs are incorrectly presumed to be Muslims. In fact, the majority of Arabs in America are Christian. And therefore, the Palestinian terrorist trope was actually a very common association of the immigrant Muslim or the immigrant Arab before 9/11. Right, it dates back to the 1960s in the US. And again, I discussed this in detail in one of the chapters of The Racial Muslim. Now, let's also talk about anti-Semitism. And there are multiple definitions that are available, but the one that many pro-Zionist or pro-political Zionists that are unconditionally supportive of Israel, regardless of its war crimes, tend to support what we call the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Act definition, which many parts of it are not problematic, but there is two specific examples that are highly problematic, and those are the only two examples that are often cited by those who support IRA to effectively quash any kind of criticism of Israel, and also to libelously claim that Muslims are anti-Semitic. So the first, the core of the definition is anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Okay, and that's all, I think, very legitimate. However, where the definition is weaponized, I think, not to combat anti-Semitism, but to effectively silence and censor any criticism of a nation state, especially their military, in this case Israel, is that included in the definition is criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitism. However, contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplaces, and in the religious sphere could, and this is a key part of the definition that nobody seems to emphasize that is a proponent of it, taking into account the overall context, include but are not limited to. And there are multiple examples, some of which are, I think, legitimately examples of anti-Semitism because they're very individualized and targeted towards Jewish people, Jewish individuals, Jewish communities or synagogues, etc. But what you have are two specific definitions that are highly problematic, and effectively what our position is that this is not an accurate description of anti-Semitism, which is that denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination in the form of, right, claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Well, there are a lot of people who claim that America is a racist endeavor in a settler colonial country. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policies to that of the Nazis, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. But again, the primary critique that's often used to weaponize this definition is that any criticism of the state of Israel or criticism of somebody who supports the state of Israel is axiomatically anti-Semitic without looking at the context. Now, what we proffer is that the Nexus document is a more accurate definition. There's also something called the Jerusalem Declaration, which I don't include in this report, but that's also another definition of anti-Semitism that at least is less politicized and more focused on actual bias and hatred towards Jewish individuals and Jewish communities. So in this definition, anti-Semitism consists of anti-Jewish beliefs, attitudes, actions, or systemic conditions. It includes negative beliefs and feelings about Jews, hostile behavior directed against Jews because they are Jews, right? That would be the basis for that hostility, and conditions that discriminate against Jews and significantly impede their ability to participate as equals in political, religious, cultural, economic, or social. So again, all of these, I think, are, at least in my position, and I can't speak for Mitchell, but I think we agree because we co-authored the report that this is a legitimate definition of anti-Semitism. And what is not anti-Semitism, as stated explicitly in the Nexus document, is criticism of Zionism in Israel, opposition to Israel's policies, or nonviolent political action directed at the state of Israel and or its policies should not as such be deemed anti-Semitic. Even contentious, strident, or harsh criticism of Israel for its policies and actions, including those that led to the creation of Israel, is not per se illegitimate or anti-Semitic. Opposition to Zionism and or Israel does not necessarily reflect specific anti-Jewish animus, nor purposefully lead to anti-Semitic behaviors and conditions. And finally, paying disproportionate attention to Israel and treating Israel differently than other countries is not prima facie proof of anti-Semitism. And it gives the example, for example, if somebody is paying attention to China's human rights record and the way that they're engaging in multiple human rights violations against the Uyghurs, that would not similarly not be considered per se or prima facie example of anti-Chinese racism. So then the other highlight the other emphasis that we do or analysis we do in the report is show this connection between Islamophobic networks, the organizations that are in the Islamophobia network, and in right-wing Zionist groups, among right-wing Zionist groups before 9/11. And what's important to note here is that the Islamophobia network has been documented by Center for American Progress, by the Council on American Islamic Relations, by the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown, by multiple organizations that look and examine who funds Islamophobia and who perpetuates Islamophobia institutionally through organizations. So many of these organizations will be familiar to those who are familiar with the Islamophobia network. So you have the David Horowitz Freedom Center, the Middle East Forum, the Center for Security Policy, Jihad Watch, Investigative Project on Terrorism, Campus Watch, Zionist Organization of America, Act for America, and Society of Americans for National Existence. So all of these groups, if you go and look them up, you'll find that for over 20 years, they have been very intentionally targeting Muslims and accusing Muslims, mosques, Muslim communities, imams of being terrorists, of being violent, of being disloyal, and often many of them supported the Muslim ban. And if you look at the right-wing Zionist organizations, many of them are the same, right? David Horowitz Freedom Center, Middle East Forum, Center for Security Policy, Jihad Watch, Investigative Project on Terrorism, Campus Watch, and Zionist Organization of America. And interestingly, or I guess troublingly, some of these organizations, their leaders were senior advisors in the Trump administration. So there is this very problematic relationship between these otherwise white nationalist political groups that are Trumpites and also these very far right-wing Zionists who have been very clear about their Islamophobic intentions. So as I wrap up, I just want to explain or want to highlight what is the agenda of the Islamophobes or the Islamophobia industry's objectives. First, investigate, prosecute, incarcerate Muslims. Second, deport, denaturalize, and exclude Muslims. Third, shut down Muslim charities and society. Fourth, marginalize and politically exclude Muslims from American society. And finally, censor, vilify, and defame Muslim leaders. And so what you will find is many of these strategies or these goals that we've seen over the last 22 years that have been well documented are similar to what many of these very far right-wing Zionist pro-Israel groups will engage in and seek as a similar objective when targeting Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. And so let me just go to my final slide, which I just want to highlight because many people will go and criticize Palestinian human rights groups and claim that they're anti-Semitic, but in fact, I put on the slide here, this is what their agenda is. This is not an anti-Semitic agenda. This is a human rights agenda that is focused on Palestinians as human beings. So there are many people support, it's a majority view so far, is a two-state solution, and those were effectively what the Oslo Peace Accords were, but sadly, and we don't have enough time to go into it, that was a failure. The second is they want to end the illegal practices of the state of Israel, from the growth of Israeli settlements in the West Bank to systematic home demolitions in the West Bank, Jerusalem, indefinite detention of thousands of Palestinian political prisoners and torture. They want to end the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Jerusalem, and many of these illegal practices have been documented by international human rights groups and have effectively caused Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and even experts in the UN to conclude that what Israel is doing in the West Bank and Gaza in particular, and to a lesser extent in Israel proper, is an apartheid system. And then just because this is December 14th, 2023, while Gazans are under siege by the Israeli military, right now, people are focused on ending the blockade of Gaza that's been around since 2005. And again, you can see from the data on the screen that the conditions of Palestinians long before October 7, 2023 have been horrendous, right? Over 62% of Palestinians in Gaza depend on food aid. The single electric plant that was there that was effectively bombed after the first week has operated only at 50% capacity. Hospitals have always been unable to obtain enough medicine, electricity, and equipment to treat Palestinian patients in Gaza. There's been severe restrictions imposed by Israel on the agricultural and fishing industry of Palestinians in Gaza. Israel destroyed the airport and the seaport in Gaza in 2001, which is one reason why nobody can even fly out, much less get on a boat to escape Gaza right now. And then finally, you can look at, we did a series of teach-ins at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights that you can see on our YouTube channel. And I will just highlight the last point, which there has been, it's a minority view, and I will allow Mitchell and Jonathan if they'd like to elaborate on this, but there was a growing minority view of a single secular ethno-nationalist state for Jews, Muslims, and Christians that would effectively be from the river to the sea, right? So everybody would live in one state, and it could be a federalist system, or it could be semi-autonomous communities or political communities. But there's a book that I would highly recommend by multiple Middle East scholars of various backgrounds, is called The One State Reality. What is Palestine? What is Israel-Palestine? That is effectively the realization by many scholars that Israel's settlements and its blockade of Gaza and the way that, and the wall that it has used to insulate and shrink and trap Palestinians in the West Bank has made it impossible for there to be a two-state solution. So these are effectively the conversations that Palestinian human rights groups, whether they're Muslim, Arab, South Asian, or other communities, this is the conversation they want to have. But instead, they're constantly being accused of being anti-Semitic, and those are just ad hominem attacks that really do not have any basis in the facts and in the information, or I should say, it doesn't have any basis in the facts of their actual advocacy. So with that, I will end, and then I will cede the floor to my co-author, Mitchell Plitnick. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. So, picking up on a lot of what Sahar just introduced, I look at this report, and even though we wrote it almost entirely, well, in fact, entirely before the events of October 7, it addresses, I think, a very key question that has arisen over Israel's onslaught on Gaza. And that is, the obvious one is that how is it that the United States can so easily support Israel in what has been very clearly termed, even by allies, as the most devastating military attack of the 21st century? It is one where the death total is now over 18,000. That's mostly women and children and overwhelmingly non-combatants. That ratio is very clearly much higher than the 2-to-1 ratio that Israel claims. The answer to this question, I mean, there are many reasons, and we can talk about many of them, but the one that we're looking at is how U.S. policy is influenced not just by a sort of pro-Israel approach, but that there's a flip side to that is anti-Palestinian. So where does that come from? It comes, of course, from many decades of antipathy in U.S. culture towards Muslims and Arabs. That antipathy was, for most of the 20th century, I think, characterized by a sort of contempt, a sort of sense of superiority. But in the 1970s, it started to become sharpened towards more of an enmity. I think that was in part a result of some major events like the oil embargo of the early 70s and then the Iranian Revolution of the late 70s. And all of this was presented as a counter to support for Israel. So these were, Israel was the good guys, Arabs and Muslims, be they Arab or be they Persian or wherever else pretty much around the world, were the bad guys. This led us into this sort of era of transitioning from a Cold War approach to the Middle East to one that was characterized by the idea of a clash of civilizations. The book by Samuel Huntington that came out in the 90s that describes the idea of a Western civilization battling a decidedly backwards Islamic civilization and looking at our foreign policy through that lens. And I think this got sharpened also, again, in many ways, because the Oslo process at the end of the 20th century collapsed and the Second Intifada was launched. This was a more violent Intifada than the first, although there was like the First Intifada, a great deal of nonviolent resistance that was taking place. But of course, that doesn't get into the media. It doesn't get reported because it's less sensational. So people only really saw the violence of the Second Intifada. And this also coincided with the rising and the strengthening of what we call the Islamophobia industry that Sahar outlined. And this fed into the attack on Iraq and the what was termed the influence of the neoconservative movement on U.S. foreign policy during the George W. Bush administration. These neoconservative groups included groups like the Center for Security Policy, Middle East Forum, Robert Spencer's Jihad Watch, the Jewish Institute for National Security, JINSA, I forget the full name. These groups had a profound influence on the Bush administration's foreign policy. They are conservative, Republican, right-wing groups, largely Republican anyway. And yet they also have a very powerful voice in Washington that is unavoidable, whether or not Republicans are the ones making policy. These groups remained influential in Washington despite their disastrous failings, and influential enough to be a thorn in the side of the Obama administration to quit, the most radical of them, particularly the Zionist Organization of America, became close allies to the Trump administration. And they still have some pull on the Biden administration as well. So even though these are, you would think, groups that would be mostly influential on Republican administrations, they have had profound influence on Democratic administrations as well. That, in more recent years, I think, has increasingly mixed with Jewish groups, Jewish pro-Israel groups, such as AIPAC, as we all are very familiar with. And AIPAC, which once prided itself on its bipartisanship, has moved sharply to the right, and that has caused some alienation in the Jewish community and some difficulties with some of its supporters, but it has increased its supporters among the right, and the right tends to also have a great deal of the wealth in both Jewish and non-Jewish communities, and that has helped to spur on their action. But I think most tellingly, we've seen Jewish groups such as the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, become much more, they were always a part of this process, but I think they've become much more central in defining anti-Semitism and redefining anti-Semitism as support for Palestine and for support for Palestinian rights. So much so that I think at this point, with the attacks on October 7th and the heightened emotion and anger and fear that those attacks engendered in the Jewish community, we have gotten to a point where real anti-Semitism, which stems from white nationalism and which is actually part of many of these right-wing groups that we talk about influencing policy, that has become sort of marginalized and even made invisible. Whereas this new definition of Palestinian rights as being anti-Semitic has taken sort of center stage. So we see this now in the controversies over particular terminology, from the river to the sea, the very word intifada. And now I've actually just seen today an article that called it an anti-Semitic incident because somebody heard someone say "Free Palestine." And something that you cannot get more of a clearly political statement than that, and one that is clearly human rights oriented. What we're seeing is a process of redefining these terms away from what Palestinians are saying to what various individuals want you to believe that they are saying. So, and that has the effect that we see, I think, on campus these days. When we're talking, we constantly hear testimonies from young pro-Israel Jewish students who say they feel threatened, they feel afraid. That fear is real. Okay, they're not lying about that. That is how they feel when they hear the word intifada. That is how they feel when they hear from the river to the sea. But why are they feeling that way? They're feeling that way because these terms have been defined for them in ways that are not the real meanings. So when intifada is a very I think key term here, because this is an Arabic word that literally means shaking off. It's used to mean resistance, and it can mean many different forms of resistance. It absolutely includes nonviolent resistance. In fact, the first intifada, when Palestinians adopted this phrase and made it famous to non-Arabic speaking people all over the world, that intifada was overwhelmingly, not entirely, but overwhelmingly nonviolent. Strikes were the main feature of it. And that is a point that I think is very frequently lost. And that does not, being nonviolent does not make it not an intifada. That was exactly what characterized that uprising. But when you tell, young Jewish students that word is a call for your death, that word is a call for genocide against you, that has a real effect. And that has been manipulated very cynically to affect not only those students, but also their parents, and also just people who are concerned. And so now we see this growing momentum where, bizarrely, in the halls of our own Congress, we have white nationalists, literal white nationalists, people like Representative Elise Stefanik, who is a promoter of the Great Replacement theory, a woman who absolutely believes in and has worked to promote a theory that was the very chant that was spoken by the explicitly anti-Semitic demonstrators in Charlottesville that supposedly so appalled Joe Biden that he felt he had to run for president. Here is this woman now weaponizing anti-Semitism to distort the meaning and to make people afraid, again, of Palestinians. In many ways, for me, at least, as somebody who can think back to the 1980s, to the 1970s, when it was the word Palestinian was almost never uttered without it immediately being followed by the word terrorist. The first Intifada and the image of the young boy throwing a rock at a tank had a profound effect and started to really change that. And I think over the years, much to the chagrin of pro-Israel forces, Palestinians were seen as human. They were seen as deserving of rights. They were seen by Americans as real people and not just somebody, people who are a problem or something in a headline. That is what is actually under attack right now, because as long as Palestinians are seen as human, you see a great deal of pushback against policies that dehumanize them. While Joe Biden has been happy to continue to arm Israel in this assault on Gaza, right? We are seeing unprecedented pushback from within the administration. Not even, we're not, proud, as Jonathan and I are both board members of JVP, and I know that we are both extremely proud of the actions that have been taken by our organization that have shown the world that not all Jews support what Israel is doing. In fact, there are quite a few of us. There are enough of us to shut down Grand Central Station, to shut down the Senate building, to shut down the Statue of Liberty. We have shown people that is true, but there remains this widespread perception that there is a justification for what Israel's doing. We're also seeing in the administration itself, we're seeing letters coming from the Department of Homeland staffers at the Department of Homeland Security. We've seen protests by staffers in Congress, and just yesterday we saw a vigil outside the White House by White House staff. I've never seen anything like this. By White House staff lighting candles, spelling out the word ceasefire, and holding up a banner saying, President Biden, your staff calls for a ceasefire. So these things matter, and they do make a difference, and they're the result of Palestinians being seen as human, and that's why these groups are so determined to turn back the clock to a time when the only way we could think of Palestinians was as people who are less than human and are only violent and are only threats. So I will, with that, pass the mic along to Jonathan.
Thank you, Mitchell, and thank you, Professor Aziz. Before I get started, just please bear with it. Thursday is gardening day in our building, so I apologize in advance for any sounds of leaf blowers or things like that. Which you hear, I've shut all doors and windows, and hopefully that'll do the trick. So thanks so much for that overview. It's a really compelling conversation. I just kind of wanted to introduce Jewish Voice for Peace, and right off the bat say, thanks for the compliments at the top. Whatever, I'll just defer all those on as compliments in general towards JVP and nothing to do with me personally. So Jewish Voice for Peace is the largest progressive Jewish anti-Zionist group in the world, and there's a few qualifications in there. There are actually even larger Jewish anti-Zionist groups which wouldn't necessarily follow be considered sort of progressive politically. In particular, religious Jewish anti-Zionism is a very large, widespread, and completely overlooked fact of particularly Orthodox and Haredi Jewish life. But we are the largest. We formally embraced anti-Zionism, I believe it was in early 2019. I'll just kind of speak a little bit generally about what are sort of our particular lens of Jewish anti-Zionism is, and then redirect the conversation, I think, where it most urgently needs to be, which is on Zionism's foremost victims, i.e. the Palestinians. Although we should stress a large part of Jewish anti-Zionism is in no small part because of the very many ways in which we believe Zionism has actually hurt Jewish communities, and both directly in the lands that we call Palestine-Israel and throughout the world through sort of political partnerships that, for example, the state of Israel has had with right-wing governments, right-wing anti-Semitic governments throughout history and including today, as well as the kind of the artificial separation that it's created in the minds of communities throughout the world, as well as in the minds of Jewish communities themselves, artificial separation of Jewish communities throughout the world from the places in which they live and the neighbors among whom they live. So at Jewish Voice for Peace, we are firmly committed to Palestinian liberation. Our political analysis shows us that as an American-based Jewish organization, our contribution to that struggle for Palestinian liberation and justice is by ending the United States support for the state of Israel. I don't think it's any mystery to anybody on this call just how critical U.S. diplomatic, financial, and military support for the state of Israel has been to its ability to continue dominating Palestinians. So we see our mission as stopping that, and in particular the means of accomplishing that by growing Jewish opposition to Israeli war crimes, to the persecution of Palestinians, and by dispelling the myth that those actions represent Jewish safety, are necessary for Jewish safety in any shape or form. So that's kind of an overview of JVP. And how we seek to act in that, and Mitchell mentioned our sort of we take a lot of pride in how we've been able to show that message throughout the country in the actions that we've taken over the last 2.5 months since the beginning of the assault on Gaza. I'll mention up top. Jewish Voice for Peace does not in any way underestimate or downplay the reality of anti-Semitism in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world. In fact, we would like to think that we're one of the few groups that actually take it seriously, and take it seriously as an assault on Jews for being Jews, and not in any way as conflating that with opposition to Israeli state policy or the persecution of Palestinians. In fact, we actually, as Mitchell was saying, we see attempts to characterize calls for Palestinian justice as anti-Semitism as actually deflections of the real anti-Semitism. Mitchell mentioned before, at this point it's almost banal. It's so regular, but the just brazen support for the state of Israel by people who make less and less effort to hide their own hostility towards American Jews, for example, here in the United States, and similar moves are taken in other countries, whether it be France or Hungary or the UK or the Netherlands. And so we fight against that conflation, and partly because we realize that it's necessary to do so to combat the very real anti-Semitism that exists and that persecutes Jews for being Jews, for supposedly seeking to undermine the states that they live in, or as Mitchell mentioned in the Great Replacement Theory, to reverse white dominance, which those very same anti-Semites see as inherently good. So the conflation of Palestinian resistance or of the Palestinian struggle for justice as anti-Semitic undermines the very necessary work to combat that real anti-Semitism. And it's also, it sort of sets up a reverse chronology. I'll maybe pause here because I've spoken for a while for interjection, but it sort of it establishes the creation of the state of Israel and an ethno-state run by Jews as a sort of a uncontested moral good, and the people that suffer as a result of that have to be, according to that logic, dehumanized and set up as sort of incorrigibly and innately anti-Semitic in order for that ethno-state to be presented as some sort of moral good or moral necessity. And I guess an example that I'll cite, and one that I've seen over the last couple of years, is the question of return for the Palestinian refugees of 1948 in the Nakba. At least 75%, possibly upwards of 80% of Palestinians were uprooted from their homes in that war. And at least twice over the last year, I've seen appeals for their restitution and for their return characterized as anti-Semitic because it would essentially undermine the Jewish majority in the state of Israel. So a very basic call, one that I think all believers in human rights would recognize as just inherently just, which is people should be able to return to their homes. That basic human desire is somehow set up as motivated out of some sort of desire to deprive Jews of demographic majority in a state. It's a sort of a backwards, almost confounding ideology in which supposedly, I guess people should have welcomed their own expulsion because of that, because of some sort of moral necessity of creating that demographic majority. And so it's an example of how the only way you can fight against, or the only way you can undermine Palestinian claims for justice and for restitution is by essentially setting up their basic lives as inherently being some sort of obstacle to Jewish safety or Jewish self-determination, in a way that we think completely muddies the water of anti-Semitism and deflects attention from where it's most needed. So I'll pause there and happy to answer questions or comments on that.
Thank you to Jonathan and Mitchell. Thank you both. As we wait for questions, I want to share my screen just one more time because we're living in a moment right now that has caused some serious concern among academics in general, journalists, media, free press advocates and free speech advocates. And effectively, some people have called it, a McCarthyistic regression in terms of the ways in which many of these far right-wing Zionists are attacking those who are defending Palestinians' human rights, whether it's Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, Not in Our Names, or Muslim organizations, and even including the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, right? We just had senators in the US Senate criticize us by name, the center that is the only and first civil rights center focused on Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in a US law school that was effectively summarily defamed and vilified as anti-Semitic. So it just goes to show how ridiculous and how desperate and how completely unfounded some of these what I think are just ultimately anti-Palestinian racists, not people who are in fact concerned with anti-Semitism, but the extent that they'll go. So let me just show you quickly, as people put their questions in the Q&A, some of the things that at least I've noticed. So first, you've got many of those on the far right, political Zionists. What is their agenda? Right? Let's explore their agenda. Because I've already told you what the Palestinian human rights agenda was, which was, again, to support the human rights of Palestinians. The first is many of them outright, unashamedly support Israel's current mass starvation, mass dehydration, and indiscriminate bombings of Palestinians in Gaza, which are clearly war crimes. And all one needs to do is look at the United Nations and the International Red Cross and all of the international organizations whose role is to protect refugees and to protect people, displaced people in war, and other victims, right, of war. They're also engaging in lawfare, right, and abusing the U.S. Department of Education's Title VI complaint process to effectively argue that when students are engaging in free speech rights in defense of Palestinian human rights, that is anti-Semitic, right, as opposed to a Jewish student is attacked, is assaulted, experiences harm because of their Jewish identity, right? That's anti-Semitism. But what we're seeing is most of the definitions and most of the complaints are really about censorship of political dissent. You've got defamation campaigns, right? McCarthyistic blacklists of professors and students who defend Palestinian human rights. That's been going on for decades. We have assaults on employment and economic opportunities where people are getting fired and not being hired for political speech they're engaging in outside of work, right, on social media, completely separate from the workplace. You're getting presidents of universities. We just saw this with the University of Pennsylvania with President Gill, who was effectively ousted ultimately because she allowed a festival about Palestinian literature and art and poetry called Palestinian Rights, WRITES, to occur on the University of Pennsylvania. And it wasn't even a university-sponsored event, but many faculty organized it. And there was nothing illegal about it, nothing that related to terrorism or violence. In fact, it was a celebration of Palestinian culture, but that got defamed as anti-Semitic, and that essentially started the witch hunt against her to ultimately get her fired. You have the shutting down of student groups. The Students for Justice in Palestine across the country are being shut down, right? Imagine if all of the Hillels were shut down, or the various Jewish organizations that were Zionists or that were pro-Israel were shut down. There would be a lot of concern and questions and backlash, but instead you're getting cheering. And even the Jewish Voice for Peace in Colombia was shut down. And false accusations of material support to terrorism against SJP by the American Defamation League, right? So the American Defamation League is also, I think, ultimately harming the Jewish community by misdefining anti-Semitism, right? And effectively it's put itself in a position that it appears more like a group that supports a nation state of Israel's hawkish right-wing militaristic policies, as opposed to a civil rights organization that cares about the civil rights of Jewish Americans. And then finally, you're seeing prohibitions of college activism and demands to stop panels, protests, sit-ins, teach-ins. Again, there's been many emails that have gone to Rutgers University attempting to shut down our events. And those of you who are watching live or who will watch afterwards, you can judge for yourself whether there's anything here that is problematic. All it is essentially what American universities do, which is debate, discuss, and explore different perspectives. So then I will stop that, and we will take some questions.
So we talk a lot about the media and how media covers this, and the thing is about particularly American mainstream media is that there's a lot of it, and most of it's very shallow, right? And when we do surveys, we can talk about how often they give you a bit of news from the Israeli point of view, how often they give it to you from the Palestinian point of view, and clearly there is a disproportion there. That being said, we have to also be careful not to talk about that in absolutes. So just for an example, CNN has a terrible record on reporting on Israel-Palestine issues. But just this morning, as it happened, I saw a report from CNN. They were able to get into Gaza without being embedded with the Israeli army, which is how most of the American and European journalists have gotten into Gaza. So they're embedded with the Israeli army, and they're told what to film, what to stop filming. So they're basically acting as propagandists. CNN got a team in with an independent NGO, so they could do a report. And they did a very powerful report. They went to a tent hospital that had been set up by the UAE in Rafah. I think it was in Rafah. It was somewhere in the south, and it was devastating. We're seeing the young children who are victims of the Israeli onslaught. We're seeing the impossible conditions that doctors are trying to work under. They showed the surrounding areas and the complete lack of food, the lack of any sort of facilities, lack of water. They talked about the virtual absence of medical supplies and medicine for these doctors to try and work with, and we're seeing the results. They did not blur the shots. They showed you these I was crying. I have to be honest. I was crying through most of it. I was seeing these little children, and occasionally their relatives. For the most part, their parents were dead. It was absolutely heartbreaking and shattering. Does this cancel out the rest of what CNN does? No, it certainly does not. But we have to be very careful to not talk in absolutes, because that'll get brought up right away. Number one. Number two, we also need to acknowledge when that happens and promote it and show and spread it around to people and say, look, you can do good coverage of this. You can show the humanity of people in Gaza. And so I think that is a particularly important point for us to think about. But when I also think that I've gone around with this question for over 20 years. How do we craft our messaging and deal with this? And I have come to the conclusion that there's a limit to how much of that we should do. To some extent, one of the things that I think people have to remember is that the facts on the ground support Palestinian rights, support largely the Palestinian, not entirely, but largely the Palestinian. That no one side's narrative is ever 100% right, but they largely do support the Palestinian narrative, and certainly in extreme times like this one, we know what the facts are. We have them, and we should not be trying to present them objectively. We should be presenting them with all the horror that we feel in our hearts, and we should be very clear about that. That does not mean we should be attacking people and not trying to get people to listen, but I think when we overly craft our message, we lose that emotional impact, and that is what's on our side. Because in terms of crafting the message and putting it out there, that requires resources, and the pro-Israel side will always have far more resources than people fighting for justice for all people, for all the people between the river and the sea. And we can keep saying that because it means the whole land of Israel and Palestine.
Thank you. Jonathan, I'll ask a couple others, and you can answer the media one as well when you respond. But there have been some questions regarding some of the language that the Palestinian human rights protests have used, whether it's Intifada, From the River to the Sea, Free Palestine. And somebody stated, I really appreciate the comments about how Jewish students are generally sincere when they say they feel threatened or scared when they hear invocations of Intifada, From the River to the Sea. It is so critical to recognize that those terms have been weaponized, redefined, and redeployed specifically to make them feel that way, right? And so given that, how do we start trying to reach out to those students and bring them into more productive dialogue? And how do we help others understand that profound clash of perspectives? And I'm sure you all have had many conversations about that with Jewish Voices for Peace.
Of course. So, I'll start off with that. It is necessary, I think, to understand the sincerity of that fear from a lot of Jewish students. And, I'll just say, we at JVP don't pretend that we all sort of have been lifelong anti-Zionist Jews. I would venture to probably say most, if not a very large portion of us, of the many thousand members of JVP, grew up with some, with some form of Zionism that we learned, whether it's the home or the synagogues that we went to, or just sort of in the general culture. Zionism is, at this point, it hasn't always been, but certainly, for the since the 50s, 60s, has been hegemonic in American Jewish life. And we see our role as reversing that trend. We're, I think, certainly making progress compared to how things were 20 years ago, and I think the trends are undoubtedly in our favor. But I can say from personal experience, I know what it's like to buy into the basic assumptions of Zionism and to feel if not physically threatened. Personally, I've never felt that way, but I used to feel the large, when I was sort of in my late teens, early 20s, large feelings of alienation and fear, and even just kind of like just feeling apoplectic when those basic assumptions were questioned, even as I consider myself at the time to be aware of the plight of Palestinians and to want a solution to it. There were limits, I guess, that I had internally, and it never occurred to me at the time that it would in any way put into question the basic beliefs of Zionism. So the media question, I'm definitely not a media expert. I consume sort of very little of at least mainstream media, so I don't have any expertise on that. But in terms of how to address what are genuinely sincere beliefs, it's largely through, again, humanization of Palestinians, and I think patiently sort of exploring, I guess, and trying to sort of hear more and engage in a kind of a question and answer, maybe with those who are with those who are, for example, fearful of the slogan "From the river to the sea." And I've heard it said, well, I've heard it expressed as if it almost sort of goes without saying that would inherently mean driving Jews out from the land, some sort of genocide, things like that. And I guess it would say, well, if you thought that Palestinians were free between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, and free in the very real sense of being able to return to their homes, free from occupation and settler violence, in terms of the Palestinians living within the 1948 borders, free from I forget exactly how many laws it is that apply only to, it's in the dozens, if not hundreds, free from all those legal constraints. What is it what is it in that which entails or necessitates some sort of, kind of reverse ethnic cleansing? And ultimately, when they kind of think about it, they're like, well, no, it doesn't. I mean, it's and I also point out that the Israeli government itself frequently uses the moniker to say, I mean, at this point, I've lost track of which Israeli ministers say which, but it was just last week, someone in the government said, between the river and the sea, there's only going to be Israeli sovereignty, so a contested claim about the land and the rights within it is by no means a call for people to be physically removed. We've already seen an Nakba. I mean, it's already happened to Palestinians, and simply calling for a restitution of that doesn't mean inflicting it on Israeli Jews any more than calls for land back by indigenous Americans can be construed to somehow mean white Americans being expelled from the United States either. It's a question of restitution and justice and freedom, and ultimately, if that sounds hostile or threatening, it's because of, I think, a more latent belief about the nature or attitudes of the people to be free rather than its actual meaning itself.
Thank you. No, I think that I think you're on point in terms of showing the double standard. So there's the issue of what does from the river to the sea actually mean today in 2023, not what did it mean in 1988 when Hamas initially, when it had its first charter, which it actually has amended in 2017 to state that it recognizes the 1967 borders. So in 2023, from the river to the sea means either a two-state solution, right, or a one-state, non-ethno-nationalist country for Jews, Muslims, and Christians to live as equal citizens and come up with some form of governance to either provide some self-autonomy based on religious identity or to have a fully secular state similar to what we have in the United States. Those are the two options. Those are the two definitions that are perceived or that people who chant that have. Now, is there a very small fringe group somewhere abroad that believes still delusionally and yes, anti-Semitically, that every single Jew that's from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea should be expelled? I'm sure there is, but these are small numbers, right? And that's the distraction. I could go and find, and in fact, they're in the Israeli government. Okay, there is Kahanists, and the Kahanists used to be designated as a terrorist group. They are a Jewish extremist terrorist group. They were responsible, one of their members assassinated Rabin for signing the Oslo Agreement. And when one of their members or more was elected to the Knesset, what does the US do? It de-designates them as a terrorist organization, even though their agenda has not changed at all, and allows gives this guy legitimacy. And this same guy, the Minister of, I believe, Finance, is going around essentially saying, we want to ethnically cleanse and expel and kill all Palestinians in the West Bank, which is our country, Judea and Samaria, in Israel. And yet nobody in the media is saying, what is this Jewish extremist terrorist saying and doing, and how anti-peace that is? Instead, people are harping on statements made 40, 50 years ago by people who aren't even alive anymore, right? So that just shows this is all bad faith. This is political. It's not a holy war. It's a political dispute between various groups of people. But I think the group that unfortunately is dominating in the American narrative is the group that wants one of two things: either permanent occupation and permanent apartheid of Palestinians by the Israelis, or ethnic cleansing and genocide. I haven't heard anything from those who self-identify as Zionists, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Christian, whatever their identity is. None of them are talking about a feasible two-state solution. None of them are talking about, we need to pull the 1 million settlers out of the West Bank so the Palestinians can actually have a state, right? We need to figure out a way to create a real state. All it is just blaming the Palestinians for everything. Right, and not taking that kind of responsibility. So I think we need to be kind of clear-eyed about that, and we need to, if we're going to pay attention to people's language, and we're going to pay attention to that level of scrutiny, then let's pay attention to what the official Israeli government is doing. And let's also pay attention, and I'm going to share my screen one more time before I take the last question, but I want to share my screen to just show you how absolutely abysmal and horrific the circumstances are right now on December 14th, 2023, right? Actually, this is 2 days outdated, so the number is now over 20,000. 2 days ago, it was 18,500. Palestinian civilians have been killed by the Israeli military. Over 9,000 Palestinian children have been killed by the Israeli military. That's one Palestinian child in every 10 minutes has been killed by Israel. That's the equivalent of 720,000 American children being killed, because that's about 1% of all children in Gaza. You have more than 45,000, I believe it's now 50,000 Palestinians that have been injured, and they can't get adequate medical care because the Israelis have systematically bombed and destroyed the already crippled healthcare system in Gaza. You have 5,000 plus Palestinians missing. You have 1,200 Israelis that were killed by Hamas. The estimation is about 350 plus soldiers and 850 plus civilians. And you have 180 Israelis, although I think now it's down to 140, that are being held hostage by Hamas, some of whom are soldiers and some of whom are civilians. And then if you look at the funding, we in the United States, with our money that we earn, our hard-earned money as workers, we are subsidizing these war crimes that, again, many genocide scholars have reached the point that have said this is genocidal. There is no military objective for starving 2.3 million civilians. There's no military objective for denying them clean water, and there's no military objective for intentionally creating conditions that have already created mass disease, right? And contagious diseases that are lethal. And we pay Israel $3.8 billion per year, which has come out to almost 260 billion since its establishment. And how much money do we pay Hamas? We pay Hamas zero, which is good. I would not support paying Hamas any money, but that's why people are so focused on Israel, because our money is going to support these international legal violations and war crimes. And now Biden has asked for an additional 10 billion and possibly, I think it may be up to $14 billion for us, our money to go. So absolutely we should be concerned, and we should be informed, educated, engaged citizens who ask, where is our money being spent, and does it adhere to our laws, such as the Lee Amendment that says we cannot provide foreign aid. It is illegal to provide foreign aid to a country that is engaging in war crimes or human rights violations. Many of us, myself included, have criticized the US government for giving money to Arab regimes, right, who violate human rights. So I'm going to do the same thing with Israel. I'm not going to treat it exceptionally. So I think that when you actually look at the facts, you find that all of these people who are claiming that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism or criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, what they're really doing is playing right-wing politics that is leveraging and weaponizing both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So we'll have time for one more question before we end. And this is primarily related to the issue of equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, or excuse me, equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. We saw a congressional resolution. We see that apparently there's a House resolution that was passed, and there's a law that's going to be passed that wants to make it the official definition, the IRA definition that I talked about, and then you hear it a lot in the media. So Jonathan, why don't you start us off? Can you unpack that? Can you explain why that may be inaccurate, as a matter of fact, but also politically how harmful that is?
Sure. I touched on it before, in terms of I'll answer that, I guess, the second part of the question first, which is, the impact of it and how the move to classify anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism really is I think, quite strategic move to prevent the struggle against, much more real anti-Semitism targeted against Jewish people for being Jews, and sort of deflecting any efforts to combat that very real phenomenon onto basically, opposition to the state of Israel thousands of miles away. And it's a very easy, as I think you both mentioned before, it's a very easy card to play for the growing number of elected officials who are openly and brazenly white nationalist. And it is very possible, in fact, quite consistent, to be incredibly hostile to Jewish life here in the United States, and to be very supportive of the state of Israel. And it's quite simply because it's deflecting any responsibility to care for Jews in this country, or wherever, any other country where this kind of conflation happens, to deflect that responsibility and put it all in the state of Israel. And more and more people are being quite brazen about the fact that they are openly hoping for a mass departure of Jews from countries throughout the world into the state of Israel. I guess I would point out, like, Zionism, the political Zionism as we know it, started as a Christian idea, mostly in Britain. It's always been embraced, particularly by higher ups in Western powers, as a means of ridding themselves of native Jewish populations that they did not want. This was certainly the motivation of Balfour, for whom a street is named after, in Israel. And so I guess I would say, there's really no, it's quite consistent, actually, for the position of Zionism to be quite hostile to Jewish life everywhere else except within the state of Israel. And even then, I mean, the more sort of end times oriented Christians, obviously, believe that in the long term, even the Jews who are there will be forced to either. I mean, the theology on that is I think well known, and maybe a subject for a different one, but it is completely indifferent to the actual safety and flourishing of Jewish life as we know it today, anywhere, certainly in this country, and even very often in the state of Israel. So it's it's a conflation that we firmly reject, and it's one that essentializes us, Jews here in the United States or anywhere else, as basically being proxies for another country. And it only sort of stirs a confusion, and I would argue only even exacerbates a real anti-Jewish attitude, which is that if the state of Israel and its defenders in countries throughout the world increasingly persist in this conflation of the state of Israel as representing Jews worldwide, as every prime minister of Israel likes to present themselves as being. It is only reinforcing and exacerbating, I think, quite deliberately so, acts of hostility against Jews because of those actions as well. I mean, we can only expect certain results when we continually insist that any criticism or hostility to the state of Israel is somehow a hostility to Jews per se, and as such, thankfully the vast majority of people can see through that ridiculous assertion, but some will always sort of buy into it, and I think it's unfortunately, many of those who push that conflation are quite aware of the fact that it's going to be taken seriously by some, and they persist anyways, which is just tragic.
Thank you, Jonathan. Mitchell, did you want to comment on that?
I kind of want to take it in a slightly different direction. I saw somebody ask in the Q&A about how they can support anti-Zionist Jews. I'm speaking for myself here. This is strictly my point of view, but I'm not really that concerned about people supporting anti-Zionist Jews. The job that I was one of Jewish Voice for Peace's first 2 staff members back in 2002. And I have always seen the role of Jews in the struggle for Palestinian rights as being the people who are doing the supporting. That is our job. Our job is to support Palestinians struggling for their rights. Now, within the Jewish community, there's also I don't want to call it a struggle. I mean, there's a debate that is being very unfortunately stirred up into something much worse, something much more divisive and destructive by outside forces between and among Jews, and this has been going on since long before there was a state of Israel, about what the Jewish future should be. What should it look like? I think there are things that we can take away from Zionism that can be the seeds of something that brings Jews together. I mean, one thing Zionism did do is kind of craft this concept of a Jewish nation out of both European and Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, and Jews from all over the world. It did that in a very negative way, in a very, frankly, racist way, but it doesn't have to be that way. It still was done, and we can transform that in our own community into something much more positive and productive for ourselves. But that's for Jews to do. That's for us to do within our own community. In terms of this struggle, the role that I think JVP should play, and that I always feel like, as somebody who approaches this as a public figure, an academic, and a writer and a speaker, my job is to talk about why Palestinian rights are universal. My job is to support those struggles that Palestinians are taking on themselves. If there is one thing that you can look at right now, and this has been true of the Biden administration, the Obama administration, Trump, Bush, you can go all the way back to LBJ, to JFK, that has been true through every American administration, is they have all talked with Israel about how to deal with the Palestinians. What should be the resolution of what was called in the 1940s and 50s the refugee question, the Arab question, and then later the question of Palestine and the nature of Palestinians. This was all happened without the Palestinians. Right now, one of the biggest tools of distraction away from what is happening today in Gaza, this horror that is happening, this genocide that is happening today in Gaza, one of the biggest distractions is that the United States wants to talk about the day after. What comes next? Well, it's not, first of all, it's not about what comes next, number one. And number two, the one thing that is not on the table in any of those discussions is, what do the Palestinians want? That is never discussed. That do we give Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority? Do we give it over to some sort of Israeli, indirect reoccupation? Do we bring in an international force? Nobody is asking the Palestinians and the people of Gaza and the people in the West Bank, what do they want? And that should be the only question. If we believe in democracy, if we believe in justice, and if we believe in human rights, that is the only question. And the notion that that somehow Palestinians are exempt from that is obscene, frankly. And this has been a constant. So, I'm glad that groups like JVP, I have enormous pride both in my own history with JVP and my current involvement in what this organization has done and become. It is so many wonderful Jews and allies. And I do believe that the key to changing U.S. policy in this regard is that alliance between Jews and Arabs and Muslims and everybody who believes in justice. And I believe Jews have a very important role to play in that, and that is important. But this is not about, for the Jewish community, it can be about the question of Zionism. For the rest of the world, this is about how do we support the Palestinians. And I think that's where the focus needs to be. And I appreciate very much that people want to help support groups like Jewish Forces. Please do. Go to jvp.org, support us in every way you can. I'm very proud of the work we're doing. I think it's important. I think we're contributing a lot. But we can do this. And one thing JVP has really always been great at is supporting each other and supporting ourselves. So we're okay. Is I guess the message. Please help out with the cause rather than worrying about us.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your insightful comments, Jonathan, and Matz and Mitchell Plitnick. Thank you to everyone who took time to watch, and to those who are watching after the event on our YouTube channel, which we encourage you to subscribe to, Center for Security, Race, and Rights. We also encourage you to read the report, Presumptively Antisemitic, Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse, which can be downloaded at csrr.rutgers.edu. It's on our homepage, first banner, or you can go under Issues, the Color of Religion. We also encourage you to follow us on social media, Rutgers CSRR Instagram, RUCSRR Twitter, and Facebook. And please support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. As you can see from what we have talked about today in our many lectures, we provide an essential perspective that unfortunately is lacking in many mainstream outlets and many universities, and that is the perspective of the diverse experiences of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in the United States and abroad, and also of their allies. And so today we're really grateful, we're very grateful for our allies, Mitchell Plitnick and Jonathan Matz and Jewish Voice for Peace, for joining us today. And we hope to see you at our next event, which will be in January. So you can find out more by going to our website under lectures. And with that, I wish everybody a blessed holiday season and a restful winter break and a happy new year. Ma salama.